I appreciate the invitation. And what I wanted to do was just lay out some thoughts before we get to a period of questions and comments. I look forward very much to the dialogue we're going to have here today in this brief period of time. I'd like to say from the outset, I represent an area that's the most diverse riding in all of Canada. Burnaby New Westminister has over 100 languages, all major religions represented. And in the core of that community on Edmund Street is the heart of the Tamil community, Tamil Canadian community in Burnaby New Westminister. And that community has educated me to a very significant extent. To have me get involved over the course of my 8 years as a parliamentarian to understand the human rights dynamic in the past in Sri Lanka and the human rights dynamic in the present. Now, I should say that Canada should be very proud to be the center for the international Tamil diaspora. And the fact that over 300,000 Canadians are of Tamil origin should be a profound point of pride for all Canadians. And I did want to say, I believe Tamil Canadians have made an extraordinary contribution to our country. So we shouldn't be indifferent to what has happened in Sri Lanka and what is happening now. And I think that our public policy has to reflect that reality of the understanding of both the past and the present. What of the past? Well, we're aware of the past history, what can only be considered as pogroms undertaken against members of the Tamil community that led over time to civil conflict and strife in Sri Lanka. Those are understandings that we have to take into consideration when we talk about the present. Now, my friend and colleague, a great supporter of the Tamil Canadian community, Jack Layton, was somebody who I respected deeply and who had a profound understanding as well of the past in Sri Lanka and how it's reflected in the present. And I was very gratified by the response from Canadians of Tamil origin to Jack's passing last August. It struck us all deeply. It has impacted us profoundly in ways that some of us can express now and some of us will only be able to express perhaps in coming months. But Jack Layton helped to show real leadership and support that Canada needs to be there for those victims of human rights abuses in Sri Lanka and needs to respond to the concerns of the Tamil Canadian community. So we saw civil strife and the end of the war. And what of what has happened since? Well, we have representatives here from Amnesty International. I don't know if we have any representatives from Human Rights Watch. But both of those organizations, very reputable organizations, talk about ongoing problems, human rights abuses taking place in Sri Lanka. We've had problems of disappearances, very clearly enumerated by human rights organizations, even though they're doing that from afar, because they haven't been allowed to go into Sri Lanka to really assess on the ground what is happening. Though the internment camps are smaller, the internment camps are still present. And there is significant cases of widespread sexual violence and violence taking place throughout areas in northern Sri Lanka. So the situation has not resolved itself. The Sri Lankan government has not admitted responsibility either for crimes during the war or crimes that have taken place afterwards. And as we all know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was nothing less than a whitewash. And so Canada now has a role to address these issues. And this is where I want to get to the final part, the public policy part. Yes, Canada has a responsibility to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government. International institutions have a responsibility to push for an impartial and independent assessment both of the current human rights situation and also the crimes that took place during the conflict. But at the same time, Canada needs to be a harbor for those who are escaping the documented ongoing human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. Now, I was involved when the Sun Sea landed in British Columbia, visited all of the prisons where the passengers on the Sun Sea were housed. The conditions were Spartan, I would say, difficult often, particularly for the families in the prisons in Burnaby. And the pressure and effort that we were putting on the government at that time was to make sure that those individuals were treated extremely well and moved into society with the supports in place as rapidly as possible. The problem has been the government's response seems to be to close doors to further refugees arriving from northern Sri Lanka. We've seen this with legislation that has been brought forward in Parliament, and we've seen it in their attitude to the Sun Sea's arrival. Now, the problem is this. Those individuals, those passengers on the Sun Sea, did not have any other means by which they could escape through to Canada. Because of this government's current crackdown on accepting refugees through a normal process, trying to limit the lineups take place for refugee status, and because of the difficulties we're having in the immigration system right now, we are leaving no choice to those refugees who are fleeing, it should be said, ongoing human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. So I believe very strongly that the Canadian government needs to make sure that there is a refugee process in place for those in northern Sri Lanka who are fleeing those human rights abuses, and that the government, rather than bringing forward mean-spirited legislation that cracks down on those refugees, making it across the Pacific Ocean, in a leaky boat, in very difficult conditions, having no access to ongoing water or food, aside from a minimum required to sustain life, that what Canada needs to do is make sure that we're assuring those who are fleeing those human rights abuses can actually come to Canada. That has not been the case of this government. And so Canada has a dual role to play to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government, as other governments are doing, in a more dramatic way than it is now, and also to assure that refugees do have a place to come to here in Canada. Those are the public policies initiatives that I think need to come out of the current situation in Sri Lanka. I thank you for your invitation to come here today to speak to you. And I believe that Canada can play a major role should it choose to do so. And I believe Canada must play a role, not only because of our traditional background in humanitarian concerns, but also because of the presence in Canada of so many Canadians of Tamil origin who've contributed so much to our country. So thanks for the invitation. I look forward to your comments.